Hi guys, welcome back to the channel for another video on Marvel Contest of Champions. This video is focused on something that I wanted to talk about for a while, and that is the way that some champions are lost in the current game. When new champions release, sometimes they get certain abilities, certain buffs, which mean that other champions that you'd like to use a little bit more are kind of obsolete. And the champions that we're going to focus on today are champions that interact with buffs. And if you're not familiar with the way that buffs work, we have ones that are passive, we have ones that are just standard buffs, and sometimes we have ones that are node specific. So Kabam decided to build something that has a champion receiving some sort of buff. Even though this video is going to talk about several different champions, we're going to focus this on three specific ones. Morningstar, because she's able to duplicate buffs that are going on in a specific enemy, and at the same time her SP2, which interacts with that and applies more damage, and the SP3 for nullifying buffs. Loki for the reasons of stealing buffs and also constantly replicating them through SP3 and also doing stuff with heavy attacks. And finally Rogue, based on using the L1 and absorbing the enemy's buffs. Now you might be asking yourself, Rich, what's the point of this video? What kind of point are you trying to make? What kind of things are you trying to talk about? Well, I'm going to be asking a question throughout this video. Whether these champions, which we've discovered, as well as several others, are they lost on some of the newer champions being added in that have passive based buffs that you cannot steal? And are they time capsule champions, so that only ones that should really be used on content like Acts 1 to Acts 5? You know, is that a case that they should be used just solely for that and they're lost in the newer type of meta of the game? So let's begin on our adventure. Back last year I produced this video, which is I've got beef with Kabam over Rogue, and it talks about the way of stealing stuff and stealing buffs. And this was a start point where I was getting a little bit ticked off with the situation with a lot of these champions being added in. But this video goes a little bit more deeper on the situation. If you do want to check out the video, the link to it is in the description below. Unofficial Kabam Mike goes a little bit further on this and talks about the way that the invisibility buff is presented. And in particular, starting things off with Rogue. As we know, Rogue steals buffs. He also looks at Venom and also looks at Loki for the process of trying to steal the buff. And makes a good point whether or not this in fact is a passive based ability, which is annoying because in essence, and what we're trying to say is, even though it's a passive buff or passive ability or passive improvement, it's still classified as a buff of sorts. It's just passive. Now again, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, I don't care about stuff like this. Well, it's kind of important to me and a lot of other players that have champions like Rogue, like Loki, maybe champions that you've decided to rank really far up in the game and kind of finding it's falling short against those passive effects, as well as a champion like Morningstar. Now, back when Morningstar was released, it was like, oh my god, this champion's amazing. Damage output on a champion like Venompool in Labyrinth of Legends was just insane, doing hundreds of thousands of damage against them. So, yeah, what happened? It's very rare nowadays to go through the leaderboard and find potential champions other than, say, Corvus or Blade, and it's quite a good shout to see a champion like Quake or even Mephisto ranked up. Maybe that's the case, that's for war purposes as well as diversity, but it's very hard to say the reasoning for that. But you don't see a lot of old school champions. And the reasoning that the champion may not have been put further up in rosters is maybe the interaction nowadays with the passive buffs, maybe there's something to do with Mystic Dispersion, but I do see a lot of times the champion's being placed on nodes close to the mini boss leading into the main boss. So yeah, I have seen it being used, but in an offensive manner, in order to interact with buffs, there's only a slim amount of content and not more modern content, especially when you're looking at new event quests for each month. Yeah, she does have, with a signature ability, some really good questing advantages, but go up against champions that have passive based effects, not so much. Now at this point you may have got absolutely enraged by the fact that I've mentioned that Morningstar may not be of value. And yes, that I do agree that she does have amazing value. But when it comes to ranking up a champion for usage, that's something I considered back in the day. Probably about a year ago I was looking for another rank 4 and I was like toying around with the idea. I think I was talking to another YouTuber, I think it was Vex actually, and we were talking like, okay, so if you rank up to rank 4 Morningstar, I'll do the same. And I think we both didn't do it. And it's kind of good in some ways. Like we've said at the start of this video, the way that passive effects work and how the buffs appear, then, well, how are we meant to output a lot more damage off the L2 when go up against, say, new bosses, new characters being added in, and the way that Kabam are working stuff? It just didn't make sense at the time, and I'm kind of glad to a degree it doesn't really make sense now. And what of Rogue and Loki? Well, the same thing really applies as these new types of like passive based effects. And yes, in some ways they're not, but they are positive or buff based effects. Things that you'd assume a champion like Rogue would be able to interact with and definitely absorb out. Loki's mystical based powers, yeah, should do it. And I think I'm not going to push too much a comic book source argument, because that is something, even though you attribute a lot of my channel for, that is something not of talking point, even though it is of relevance. The fact is, I'd like to see Kabam really look at the way that these champions interact with buffs, be them be passive or not. But the fact is, they're in game a lot more nowadays than they've been for the last couple of years. Newer event quests see a shift in the types of buffs and nodes being used, and it's all about creatively making improvements that the player base can then think logically and go, right, well, I like using this champion, but sometimes your favorite champion doesn't fit the need of the content. And that's good and also bad at the same time. Now, every time we add a new starage rating in game, so when 5 stars were put in, and obviously, as you can see, when 6 stars were put in, a lot of the champions that don't get used quite so much get put into here. Some that maybe and more than likely are lost on the current meta of the game, so they need to damage output a lot. And it is frustrating at times to go, oh man, I really wish I could get the Domino or get a Blade if he ever gets added into the 6-star. But the fact is, certain champions won't be added in just yet because they may damage output a lot more in the scheme of things. So you're pushed to use older champions. Unfortunately, some of those aren't really brought up to code in order to make you feel, okay, so I'm going to definitely use this champion and use it a lot. And there's nothing inherently bad with these characters we've discussed about that don't really negotiate the passive effects that well. It just would be nice to see that represented, that we could have a champion that works around with them a little bit more. But in any case, it would be nice to see those buffs kind of return to be proper buffs rather than passive based effects or passive based abilities, because these champions are cool. Morningstar's cool, Rogue's cool, and yeah, I know people would kind of like doubt Loki, but Loki saved a lot of players' asses when it came to fighting against Ultron in Act 5. If anybody says about what champion to use against Ultron, use Loki for this. Kabam haven't decided to buff it or sort it out, but the fact is, I reckon because of that particular incident that people went, yeah, okay, still that intensive regen or intensive fury buff from Ultron in Act 5, the end boss, we're going to make these kind of passive based effects, so it means that these champions that could have been considered to be quite OP are now less than P. In any case, guys, thanks for tuning on into this video. It was mainly like a passion piece video, and it may ruffle a few jimmies, but at the end of the day, you've got to make something a bit out of there that you're quite passionate about. If you enjoyed this video, then hit the like button, subscribe for more Marvel Contest of Champions based content. Check out Unofficial Kabam Mike, great videos coming from that guy, as well any of the videos in the description that helped out towards this. And yeah, catch me in a live stream soon. I've been RichTheMan, and I shall catch you in the next one. Bye bye for now.